May I introduce then David Woolfson, who is a Toronto-based consultant and writer. He is Toronto coordinator of the World Future Society, a project director of the Planetary Vision Festival that comes up in Toronto next year, and executive director of the Toronto-based Global Foundation for Understanding, coordinator of the Toronto 2000 Foresight Seminars. The paper that Mr. Woolfson is presenting is Humanity's Evolutionary Future. It was published recently in the World Future Journal. David.
Thank you, Ken, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to present this paper, Humanity's Evolutionary Future. It's quite true, of course, that it is very difficult to consider global issues. It's never an optimistic thing. The more you read, the more you learn about, the worse it looks. And when I started to do that in my own life a number of years ago, I was practicing law, and I decided to transform myself into sort of becoming informed about global issues and trying to sort of work on projects that address them. But where I really began is I started to think, well, how did we get ourselves, I sort of accept the fact that there's some massive problems coming, and I think we're sort of, in North America, we don't really get a sense of what's going on in the rest of the world or even in our own backyards. And there's no doubt that there are some serious concerns on the horizon. And I guess it started with, well, how did we get into this situation? 20 or 30 years ago, didn't appear that this was the case. So from my perspective, I started to think about, kind of why. Why did this happen? How did we get into where we're at or where we're going, and now that we have to deal with it, and how did it happen so fast? But to develop this really crisis and numerous global issues, and there are so many issues. There are issues of the population, environment, and there are many others, of course, conflict, et cetera, and things are simply getting more complex and more complicated. And what I came to with that was that it's really got to do with our thinking, or how we think, what we think. And where do we learn that? And that sort of, you're born and you grow up in a society, and you kind of, there's a certain way of thinking. You don't really learn it necessarily at school. Nobody tells you that this is your worldview and this is what you believe, but it's everywhere. It's what we grow up in. And so I sort of look at this issue of worldviews, like a belief system. And a particular belief system, of course, that we're associated with is a Western worldview. And I started looking at, well, how did that develop? And it's pretty clear where the thinking came from and how it began. And then you start to see another worldview starting to emerge, an alternative worldview, and you sort of look and you say, well, maybe there's hope there. Maybe that if we can change our thinking, or if our worldview changes, then everything will flow out from there, because that's the fundamental level. What we think is the fundamental thing, because action really flows from what we think. And when we think about things, we have to take into account our values, our goals, our ethics, and that's what leads to the actions that we take. That's why human beings are unique in the natural world, because we can think in advance. I am the Toronto chapter coordinator of the World Future Society, and as well. And just in terms of the futurist perspective, I would boil that down to two issues, two things that sort of define what the futurist perspective is, as opposed to perhaps the systems perspective or any other perspective. The first of that is the long-term view, and taking the long-term view. Now, I would point out that there's a different perspective on long-term view. There might be nature's perspective, that's billions of years. The human perspective, we seem to have trouble thinking 10 or 20 years ahead. That's the long-term view. That's the view the futurist approach is 10 to 20 years, generally speaking. Sometimes 50 if you're going crazy. So there's a big distinction between what's long-term for nature and what's long-term for humanity. Obviously, our society is short-term. We can't seem to, we think quarterly or in a year, but we certainly don't think 10 or 20 years ahead very often. And the second perspective is foresight. And what does that mean? Well, what it means is that you have the ability to consider alternatives and options, and you can choose your future by acting today, or you can shape things. You can kind of sit there and think about what you want to do and do something and plan and think ahead, and then that might have a desired impact. So that's really the futurist perspective. So going back to the issue of worldviews, what is a worldview? Well, it's really composed of the basic assumptions we collectively hold about how nature works, the nature of man itself, and in man I'm using man in the collective sense, of course, not excluding anybody, and man's relationship with the natural world. So those are the three things. How nature works, what is man's essential nature, and what is the relationship between man and nature. And that's what the worldview really tells us what we think about that. So this is a societal, though not an individual phenomenon, and it permeates and underlies everything in our society. It's everywhere we go. It informs everything. The dominant societal worldview on the planet today is what is known as the Western worldview, which through globalization and global communications is dominating the planet right now. Now, where did this worldview come from? Well, it's developed over since the start of Western civilization, or European Judeo-Christian centered civilization in Sumer 6,500 years ago. And it reached another pinnacle with classic Western scientific and economic thought in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. And so I tried to determine in my own mind, although you can't really get a textbook that says the Western worldview and sort of bone up on it. I try to think, well, what is the Western worldview? What are the five? I kind of thought, well, I like the number 5. So I try to think of what are 5 things that mean to me what the Western worldview is. So I wrote those out. And I had them actually on an overhead, but I don't have time to bother with that. So the first one appeared to me, going back to the Bible, and I don't want to be irreligious or anything, but I think a lot of our culture has been determined by the Bible. The first thing that happens after creation is that man is banished from the Garden of Eden. It's called original sin, or the fall of man. And that's where history starts. So we were banished, and what did we do? Well, we got knowledge. So for obtaining knowledge, the Father, God, bans man, and paradise is lost. So we're forever condemned as soon as we begin, in other words. And we can't go back. And the door is locked. The key's been lost. Eden is lost. So that's a very fundamental concept in Western culture. Concept of punishment and redemption, and everything else flows from that. And then again, coming from the Bible, man was given dominion over nature. It was man's divine right to rule, dominate, and control nature, the earth, and all lesser creatures. And at one time that included women, of course, because Eve came from a rib of Adam, so was created second. So that's lesser creatures. And the next one, the third one, is what motivates man? What is man's nature? And this really came out of a Darwinian, or the whole Western classical science. Man is motivated by self-interest, and society is primarily a clash of individual interests. And that is the main paradigm that still exists today, is how we approach each other in our relationships, organizationally, institutionally, etc. Both the world and human society are in a state of constant competition between individuals for limited food supply, shelter, mates, etc. The strongest survive to compete another day, the weak die out. That's the Darwinian, neo-Darwinian view. The fourth one, man and the earth are at the center of the universe and as the pinnacle of God's creation. Of course, for most of the current millennium, we believe that the sun, and there wasn't any universe, the stars were fixed in the sky, but everything revolved around the earth, and then we found out, of course, that it didn't. So that's changed a lot. But we also sort of attributed this hierarchical structure of divine right and man at the center of creation, and the divine right of kings to rule. That kings, where did kings get their authority to be kings? Well, they were next to God, so they had the divine right to rule. And it was pretty hard to argue with the divine right, because who are you going to complain to? And the last one is that deals with nature. The Earth's resources and space for expansion are unlimited and infinite. And that was just based on reality. Whenever you ran out or degraded a certain environment, you just moved on. There was always another frontier. Of course, what happened in the latter part of the 20th century was that we ran out of frontiers. So now we're going to space, Sort of one of the optimistic things is that, well, after we destroy this planet, we'll all leave. But I don't think that's a very optimistic view. So hopefully there's some other choices. So that's kind of was my understanding of really what we're taught from our culture. And then I started thinking, okay, here we are. And so what's the state of the world today? Where are we at? And we're sort of at a crossroads. We have to make some changes. And the main reference I'm using for that is the 1998 State of the World report, which came from the World Watch Institute. It's just a brief quote. From 1950 to 1997, the use of lumber tripled. That's a period of 47 years. The use of lumber tripled. That of paper increased sixfold. The fish catch increased nearly fivefold. Grain consumption nearly tripled. Fossil fuel burning nearly quadrupled, and air and water pollutants multiplied to severalfold. The unfortunate reality is that the economy continues to expand, but the ecosystem upon which it depends does not, creating an increasingly stressed relationship. In addition to these dramatic global trends, since 1900, it's only slightly over, well, it's 100 years exactly, the human population has increased fourfold from 1.5 billion people at the beginning of the century to over 6 billion at the beginning of the 21st century. The authors conclude, human well-being is presently at the immediate expense of the earth. It is clearly a non-sustainable situation that eventually must end one way or the other. If the world economy as it is now structured continues to expand, it will eventually destroy its natural support systems, decline, and collapse. Well, that's, it's a quote and it's a book, but what does that mean? Well, what it means is that our civilization is going to end, probably in the next 10 to 20 years. So, when you read that kind of information, you take it seriously, you're kind of forced to, well, what do you do with that? You kind of can either put it on your mind, or you can try to think of something that you might be able to do. So I tried to take an optimistic view and think, okay, there's still time to change. But how can we change, or what kind of change is really fundamental to ensuring that our behavior changes? That, in my view, would require a massive change in our thinking. We need new thinking, we need new values, we need new ethics, in sum, a whole new worldview. For our behavior and our actions that have led to this crisis situation to change, that's what really has to change. That is the fundamental thing. We can treat all the symptoms, but nothing is really going to change unless we change the way we think at a fundamental level. Fortunately, worldviews also happen to change and evolve, not just physical systems. So there is an emerging worldview, which is clearly where the hope lies. And it's clearly come out in the last 30 years. And strangely enough, it's the exact opposite of the worldview that currently exists. It's 180 degrees in the opposite direction. And the 5 tenets that are defining, in my view, what that is, and I had a thing to put them all on one sheet, but is that we've kind of taken a different approach. Starting number 1, it was the issue of sort of man being essentially corrupt, evil right off the bat. Well, now we seem to have a more sophisticated view, and we realize that we're capable of both evil and good, that we're not just ruined, we actually can do some good things. And this kind of mirrors, I think, the way the universe actually works, because there's 2 fundamental physical forces in the universe. One is self-organization, you could call that creation or creativity, and the other is entropy, or is a chaotic force in the non-sort of good chaotic type of thing. Entropy is generally destruction, and it comes about from lack of energy being applied. So in a sense, we could, on a moral code, almost say something that things that enhance life have this moral value, while actions that diminish life do not. And that's sort of the ultimate moral standard, because that's a standard of the universe. The universe seems to be geared to try to promote life. So if we do the same kind of thing, we're probably in line with the way the universe works. But we seem to be always trying to do the opposite, which is to destroy life. Instead of being a dominator of nature, we're really supposed to be the stewards and guardians of nature and life on earth and all life on earth. So that, again, is the opposite. The third was about, the motivation of man, the nature of man being purely self-interest. Really, we have 2 primary motivations. One is self-interest and the other is altruism. And they're both in nature, and they're both to be found in human beings. So it's a balance of these 2 aspects. Man is not solely motivated by his own self-interest. We can think, we do have free will. We can be concerned about our family, our community, our global community. What we can be concerned about what happens in Africa or down the street, that's up to us. Nobody says that you can't be concerned. Especially when ultimately it's going to come back, to us. So in nature and in humankind, competition is balanced by cooperation. The fourth one is that we are not above or on top of life or dominating over other life, but we're part of the web of life, that we're an integral part of nature and dependent upon nature for survival. All life is interconnected and interdependent in the web of life. And the last is, of course, a major one that's been touched upon many times in this afternoon session, is that we've now learned that Earth's natural resources and space for expansion are no longer unlimited and infinite, but are strictly limited and finite. So we really have to adapt our thinking to those kind of principles and then to change our actions accordingly. I had quite a bit more, but I know we're out of time, so I'll thank you for listening. Thank you.